So my name is Marion Tétégan Simon, and I run direct research at Valores. It's a nonprofit that does research, applied research. We offer service and support for water analysis and in terms of food processing as well, microbiology and chemistry as well. In terms of research, mainly in terms of natural resources, both coastal and all of that will come into climate change factors into that. So today, here's the plan for my presentation. There's four main points, a little introduction, I'll present the main results and methodology, and we'll present the conclusion. So, in terms of the context, to speak of the objective of the study, as we know, it's related to the peninsula, but many coastal areas in Brunswick and Atlantic will see an increase in sea level, the frequency and intensity of storms, less ice cover on by the coast, increase in erosion and flooding. This will create more high-risk areas and probably population departures. I'm sorry, it looks like we have a little problem with interpretation on the English side. Can we have a test? Alicia says it's better now.
Well, it's better because I think the French speaker stopped speaking.
Okay. Can I go ahead?
Oui.
Yeah. So there is a lot of problems with risk regarding climate change. Donc, juste pour être sûr, Zahira, je continue en français ou vous voulez que je switch en anglais?
I'm going to continue in French now, or do you want me to switch? No, please continue in French. Thank you.
Aujourd'hui, la thématique, c'était de parler
so today we want to talk about climate change outside of or beyond infrastructure. We talk a lot about infrastructure, but we're going to talk about two themes today. So it's been several works that we've been working on adaptation to climate change. Since the 2010s with the adaptation PA project. In 2018, we had the carbon adaptation project, 2020, the aquaculture adaptation project, and in 2021, agriculture, and then we're planning another project for 2023. Today, I'm going to focus on adaptation to the climate change in terms of agriculture. So there's several subjects that come under the umbrella of this. So we have insects, pests, different scenario assessments as well. So I'm going to focus on droughts, and I guess you'll understand why in a little bit. So climate change in the food sector, they're both very interconnected. Everything that has to do with the food system comes from the soil, and soil and plants are very at the front lines of climate change, be it changes in temperature, wind, precipitation. It's very connected. It's complex to understand the impacts of climate change on agriculture and by extension the effects on human beings and our food systems. So there's been some researchers at Natural Resources Canada and others, academics who have looked at this, and some of the big issues that have been noted that have been looked at, talk about drought, so soil with a lack of water, intense rain. This involves not only the amount of rain, but the intensity of the drop, of the falling of the rain. And so this can create crevices and cracks in soil. In terms of insects, obviously some pests can appear, and there can also be benefits in the soil that can, so beneficial organisms that can disappear. So we can also have issues with fungi in vegetable production with high precipitation. Another consequence of these various challenges is yields, according to how long the problem lasts and how the climate reacts, and so there can be big impacts on yields. So in good years, we can have excellent production, and in years where the climate is less propitious, well, we can have poor yields. So what we were trying to look at was how do farmers adapt? Do they need to change their plantings? So what are the kinds of things that they do? I'm going to specifically present why we were interested in drought in the agricultural sector. So the main objective was to measure the impacts of climate change on agricultural production and to identify various adaptation measures for crops in New Brunswick. I'm going to talk about two elements of this, two aspects of this today. We did an inventory of observations by producers, by farmers on the impacts, because there's nothing better than the people out in the fields to tell us what they observe and how long these cycles last, etc. And the second part is going to be a follow-up, an experimental follow-up that we did looking at the relationship between soil and plants, so how the plants are reacting to these changes in the climate. So in terms of methodology, observations by farmers, we made an English and a French language questionnaire which addresses farmers, had only 10 questions, targeted questions. So in terms of getting it out there, we used various different ways to direct emails to these to these farmers, radio, co-ops, associations. Sorry to interrupt again. I just wanted to see if you could check. Are you using the interpretation service? Do you mind clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and make sure that you're on original audio?
Oui, je suis sur original audio.
Sorry again for interrupting you. Oh, no problem.
Donc, au niveau du questionnaire, on s'est
So in terms of the questionnaire, we looked at yields, but also quality of agricultural production. Sorry about the background noise. I'm very sorry.
On s'est intéressé à savoir si
we wanted to figure out if farmers had seen an increase or a decrease in various bacteria, insects, fungi, all sorts of different things, different benefits also that they could see, advantages that they had seen. So these are kind of the questions that were in the poll that we circulated. In terms of the trial that we did in the fields, we went to different areas of New Brunswick. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the outcomes that we found in the eastern coast of the province. So we looked at the humidity of the soil, stomatic conductivity, that's a parameter that has to do with the plant's transpiration. So the weaker it is, more the pores of the plant's close, and the higher it is, the more they open. So obviously they have a bigger transfer of humidity in this regard. We looked at 3 seasons, spring, summer, and fall. And we also looked at different types of the production, agricultural production. We looked at vegetable production. We looked at hay and other different types of, and also animal production. So the most interesting results, I'm going to present those to you now. In terms of the poll, we had 50 people who answered across the province, so you can see the different points where they're located.
Puis on a eu plus de producteurs anglophones
We
qui ont
had
demandé au sondage que de
more
producteurs
English
francophones, donc 21 francophones
speakers,
et 29
29, and only
anglophones.
21 francophones that
C'était des
answered.
producteurs qui avaient des
And
productions
these
agricoles
were
variées.
farmers that had
Il y
different
avait des
types of
bleuets,
agricultural
d'autres petits
production.
fruits comme les fraises et
There
canneberges.
were different
On
types of
avait la production
berries.
laitière avec les fourrages. On
We
avait
also looked
des
at
producteurs qui faisaient différentes sortes de légumes, puis des producteurs qui faisaient un peu de tout. Donc,
producers
on a regroupé sous la catégorie
who feed and
Donc,
also
sur ces
different types of
50
vegetables,
producteurs-là,
etc. So among these 50 farmers,
sur ces 50 producteurs, la question sur l'effet des changements climatiques sur le rendement
effects of climate change on yields showed
il y en a
us
44% qui ont
that there were
constaté que leur rendement avait
44%
diminué
that
au cours des
noticed
dernières années en lien
a
avec les changements climatiques,
decrease
selon
due
leur
to
perception.
climate change, decrease in
30%
their
pensent
yields.
que le rendement a augmenté
30% believe
en
that
lien
it went
avec
up.
les changements climatiques, puis
Their
18%
yields have gone up
pensent
due to climate
qu'il n'y a
change,
pas
and
eu d'effet
18% thought there
probant
was
sur leur
no
rendement.
real
Maintenant, au niveau
effects
de la
on their
qualité de la
yield in
production,
terms of
donc
the
même si le
quality of
rendement est
production.
élevé
Even if
ou
their
pas
production
élevé,
went up or
on
went
s'intéresse à la
down,
qualité. Donc,
we're interested
il y en
also
a
in quality
44%
here.
des
So
répondants qui ont dit que la
44%
qualité était
felt that
maintenue,
the
donc c'est
quality
quasi la
was
moitié quand même
maintained,
des
almost
réponses.
half of the
On a
answers.
20% qui
We
disent
had
que la
20%
qualité
that felt
des
that
produits
there
a
was an
augmenté. Donc là,
increase
on
in the
parle de, par exemple,
quality
des
of
bleuets qui seraient
production.
plus sucrés ou qui seraient
So
plus
some
gros,
berries that were more
à
sweet,
titre d'exemple. Puis 32% qui ont
for
noté une
instance, and
diminution de la qualité
32% noticed
de leurs produits. À
decrease in
noter
the
que
quality of
ici,
their
le terme
products.
qualité
Here,
fait
quality
référence
refers to
à des critères de vente, donc des
criteria,
critères
sales
que
criteria.
les producteurs vont utiliser pour
So the
vendre
ones
leurs
that
produits à des
farmers use when
consommateurs.
they sell their products to processors.
On leur a aussi demandé
We also
si, pour ceux
asked
qui avaient
them,
observé
for those who had
les
observed
effets, est-ce qu'ils avaient
various
cherché
impacts or a
à
change,
résoudre le problème et de quelle façon?
did they try
Et donc,
to solve the
la
problem, and how did they
majorité
do it?
n'avait
Most of
rien,
them didn't
ils n'avaient rien fait, tout simplement.
do
Donc, il n'y a eu aucune
anything,
action de fait.
so no action.
Donc, 15 personnes sur 50. Mais
So
un grand nombre a quand même fait certaines
15 of
choses,
the
comme on parle de
50, but
changement de
several of them
variété.
did do
Donc, ils ont
various things.
décidé
So changing
de produire
varieties.
une autre variété
So
ou
they
une
tried
autre
to produce
espèce
a different
de
species or different
culture.
variety of
Certains ont
crop.
commencé à faire de la
Others
rotation des cultures
started to
sur
do
leur
crop
propre champ pour
rotation
nourrir le
in their
sol.
fields to
Puis
feed their
d'autres
soil.
sont allés vers la
Others
modernisation
went
d'infrastructures
towards
technologiques.
infrastructure
Malheureusement, on n'a
modernization
pas
and
de détails
technology. We
sur
don't have any details,
la technologie
unfortunately,
qu'ils
about
ont
the
employée.
technology that they
L'hypothèse
used,
était que,
that they put in
puis
place.
pour avoir
Our
discuté avec
theory,
eux, c'est que
after
la
having spoken
majorité
with them,
avait
is that
investi
most
dans
of
tout ce
them
qui était
invested
irrigation, système
in
d'irrigation ou
irrigation
amélioration de leur système
systems or
d'irrigation.
an improvement in their irrigation
Quand on
systems.
leur a demandé
When we asked
quel
them
type de problème
what
spécifique
type
ils
of
avaient
specific
observé,
problem did
on
you
a des
observe,
réponses assez variées.
it was quite varied.
Mais majoritairement, ce qui sort du lot, c'est
Most of
que,
them, anyway,
dans un
what
premier
stood
temps, réduction
out
de la disponibilité en eau,
was
donc on a traduit aussi
a
par la
reduction in
sécheresse.
the availability of water. So we're talking
En
about
deuxième
drought
lieu,
here.
ça a été la diminution du couvert de neige et de
Place,
glace sur les productions.
reduction
Ça, c'est très problématique, par exemple, pour la production du bleuet
snow
sauvage,
cover or ice.
parce qu'on
So
a
this is
besoin de
very
cette couverture
important
neigeuse-là
for
pour
wild
protéger tout ce qui est bourgeon,
production.
qui
We
va
need
faire
to
des
definitely
fleurs, qui va faire des
protect
fruits par la
all
suite.
these things that need to produce buds or needs
En
to produce
troisième lieu,
fruits,
on a l'augmentation
obviously.
du verglas.
In third place, we
Puis
had an
ça a été
increase
beaucoup
in
observé plus dans les zones du sud, où il y avait des gels tardifs, des gels précoces,
there were
ce
late.
qui pouvait avoir des
People
gros problèmes
observed
sur la production agricole.
late frosts and
Et puis,
also
un quatrième qui sort du lot, c'est
ice.
la pollinisation. Puis ça, c'est un problème
The
qui est
fourth
de
place
plus en
was
plus grandissant.
pollination.
Il y a des défis au niveau des pollinisateurs
So
naturels.
there was a decrease in
Beaucoup de
natural
producteurs sont obligés
pollinators.
d'acheter
Several
des pollinisateurs
producers had
d'ailleurs. Ça
to
vient
purchase
même très loin des fois,
pollinators.
pour
They have to come
permettre la
from
pollinisation dans leur
from
champ.
far away, oftentimes, to use them in their fields.
Au niveau des mesures d'adaptation,
In
j'en parlais
terms
tout
of
à l'heure.
adaptation
Il y a
measures, I
une grande
spoke about
majorité
this
qui n'ont
before.
fait aucune
Most
mesure.
didn't
Puis,
put
dans
anything in
celles qui sortent
place.
du lot, on a les systèmes
In
d'irrigation,
terms of the ones that
amélioration du
stood
système
out, we
d'irrigation.
had the
Puis,
irrigation
pour
systems.
pallier à la sécheresse, il y
And
en a plusieurs
deal
qui
with
font des
the
cultures de
drought,
couverture, qui vont
or
épandre
to
du
counter the
compost,
drought,
décompacter le
they
sol,
used
etc.,
cover crops,
qui va avoir un effet sur la structuration du
decompaction
sol
of soil,
et
which
également
helps
sur sa capacité
restructure
à
the
retenir un
soil
peu plus d'eau.
to
Donc,
help
tout
it to
ça,
retain more
c'est un peu
water.
logique, mais c'était
That's quite
important pour
logical,
nous
but it's
d'aller
important for us
sur le terrain
to
pour
go
avoir
out into the field
ce que les producteurs vivent au quotidien.
to make sure that we understand what,
Donc, la
what these
deuxième
farmers
partie,
are going
c'est
through on a daily
les résultats
basis.
concernant
Next part,
les sièges sur le terrain.
results to do with the trials in the fields.
On a été plus, donc je précise, sur la côte est du Nouveau-Brunswick.
Like I said, we went more to the eastern coast of New Brunswick, different crops. I'm only showing you the ones of interest here, blueberries, feed crops, and potatoes. So here we're looking at July, August, September, and October, and we can see that in terms of the amount of water, overall water, there's an increase from July to September, and then decrease in October, which is quite classic, which is normal. These are the results from 2021. We have others from 2022 that we're currently looking at, and it's quite similar. There's a sort of stability that establishes, that sets in especially in the fall, when there's an increase in precipitation, and then there's an increase in humidity in the soil. When you look at the stomatic conductivity, we had a certain level of stability. If we look at different crops, so there were pretty big spreads here, but we could see the ability of leaves to resist stress, be it in July or even up to October, we had values that were quite similar when you look at feed crops or potatoes or blueberries. So this is kind of a trend that was stable, and overall what we tried to do thereafter is that we tried to look at the effects of soil moisture on the conductivity of the stomatic conductivity. So if we look on the left here, this is a result from July. I took the example of the feed crop here, and you see a correlation between conductivity and humidity. So the stress that the plant and the soil experience, but the soil doesn't have a mechanism to protect itself, but the plant does. So we do see this relationship, a good relationship or positive one in July, but you can see here in the other months up until October, there's no relationship, there's no positive relationship. So this shows that this ability for the plant to close and open its pores according to the water stress that it experiences, there is not a direct relationship or correlation with the soil stress here. But obviously better irrigation and better soil moisture helps the plant to produce better vegetables or fruits, obviously. So I've come to the conclusion, overall, what do we have to take away here from this presentation? We have about 30% farmers. We only had 50 respondents across the province. I know there are, of course, a lot of others. We have 30% that observed a change in terms of their yields, in terms of the quantity produced of their fruit or vegetable, and in terms of the quality, a change in the quality for their processors. 40% of respondents said they took no action to adapt to climate change, even if they said that it was present, that they noticed that it was present. Having discussed with them, they didn't quite know what to do, or 60% noticed a reduction in the availability of water for their crops, 40% decrease in snow cover, 30% saw an increase in ice on in their fields, usually due to either an early or late frost, usually in the fall. In fact, the late frost, 25% noticed a decrease in pollinators as well. Water stress, trials that we did in the fields on the eastern coast of New Brunswick, we noticed that there were fluctuations in the soil water. And when we look at the ability of leaves to open or close their pores, we noted a certain level of stability, which shows that in spite of the water stress that the soil experiences, plants are resistant and able to adapt to climate change, which is quite interesting. Certainly, there's other work to do. What we would like to do to try to cover more of the province, to look at different climate zones. What happens in the north of the province isn't necessarily what happens in the south. There's different types of soil, clay levels in the soil, and so we want to look also at how this affects the adaptation to climate change. We also want to look at what explains the change in their quality and the yields on the fields. We want to identify various solutions for adaptation. We want to know also, is it worth investing in various types of solutions? I'll give a quick example. In Europe, in wine production, grapes, there are certain measures that they take to avoid impacts from early or late frost. They have ways of heating their crops, but it's extremely expensive. There are measures that are in place in other places as well. And so we just want to see if we can implement these in New Brunswick, or how to adapt them, how to adapt crops in certain cases. It's not just adaptation. You can just change the type of crop that we're using. So we're continuing to work on that.
Donc, ma présentation est terminée. Je vous
remercie. I've completed my presentation. Thank you for listening.
J'ai oublié de le mentionner au début, c'est un projet qu'on
Thank you for listening. This is something that we do. And thank you for the environment network to allow me to present some of the activities that we're doing at Valores. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marion.
Trying to see if Carolyn can join us. So I'm going to switch right now to Q&A for Marion.
Okay, a lot of perennial food crops, fruit trees, bushes, etc., need a minimum number of chill hours to produce successfully. Are New Brunswick growers experiencing any problems because of temperature fluctuations and freeze-thaw cycles through the winters now?
Peux-tu répéter la question? Je vais aller dans l'interprétation.
Okay, can you repeat the question? I'm going to go in interpretation. Yes, please. So you should see French on interpretation. And I have a call from Carolyn. Can somebody deal with that, please?
Bushes, etc., need a minimum number of chill hours or cold time to produce successfully. Are New Brunswick growers experiencing any problems because of temperature fluctuations and freeze-thaw cycles through the winters now?
Alors, oui, c'est sûr que je n'ai pas de réponse spécifique.
I don't have a specific answer, but based on the survey that we did,
déclaré des problèmes de rendement ou de qualité de leur
production problems and quality productions related to this freeze-thaw cycle.
En début d'hiver,
so at the start of this winter,
l'hiver c'est pas un bon exemple.
Well, winter's a bad example. In the spring, actually.
Le printemps s'installe, etc.
So spring,
Puis
it
tantôt j'en parlais dans la
sets in.
présentation.
I spoke about this in my presentation. So you have a late freeze.
Ça cause de gros
So
problèmes.
this causes major
Je sais que dans
problems.
l'industrie du
I know
bleuet,
that
par
in the
exemple,
blueberry
il y a
industry,
eu
for
une
example,
de grosses
they
pertes,
had major
50%
losses, over 50%
de champs qui étaient
of their
perdus.
fields lost.
Puis ça, c'est des gros dommages.
That's major
Beaucoup de
damage.
conséquences au niveau économique
So many
pour ces
consequences
producteurs-là.
for the revenue
Certains
for
n'ont
that
pas
producer.
d'assurance agricole.
Some don't have agricultural
Ça crée des
insurance.
problèmes de revenus à
So
la
this
fin.
creates revenue issues at
Oui,
the
c'est
end.
quelque chose qui est ressorti dans le
I know
sondage.
this is something that came out in this survey.
And the second part of the question is, are they identifying any solutions, like different varieties that can cope better with the temperature swings and season changes?
Pour l'instant, il n'y a aucune solution
For now, there's no solution that was really implemented, nothing specific. On our end, Valores is then, we haven't provided any specific solutions depending on the type of crop. But some producers are doing some things. People who have started some initiatives, like, for example, putting mulch to protect mulch, to protect them from climate events. But there's nothing specific for the moment that was suggested or advised. So unfortunately, the climate risk is here.
Ils le subissent en fait.
And they experience it, and they have to deal with it for now. We're doing a lot of work right now as regards documenting things and hydrographically to see what is being done elsewhere. How do they do these things? Can it be applied here, etc.? We're still doing that work. We haven't managed to define a single approach, but we do know that we'll need to have adaptation plans to climate change for specific to specific crops, specifically for regions. For example, the methods and procedures that you might use for blueberry won't necessarily be the same as for potatoes or forage crops. There's a part of my presentation that I didn't speak to you about. It's related to milk production. A lot of producers mentioned about the challenge that they have with the cows, the quality of milk. It's not necessarily the same when it's hotter or when it's too cold. So these are all elements to take into consideration. And dairy production is indeed something that's important in New Brunswick. It's significant. Milk production, forage production, potato production, blueberries, major agriculture industries in New Brunswick. And we foresee working first with those types of crops, and then working on other types of crops. They're smaller, but they're still significant.
Okay, so I hope that answered your question. Are there any other questions for Marion at this moment?
In the next NB
Dans la prochaine réunion de CCNB, non, c'est pas la bonne question, c'est un commentaire.
Actually, I don't think there are any other questions.
Zomi, what is our status for Caroline?
She is just getting out of a doctor's appointment with her sick kid. So
dear.
She should be on any minute.
Okay.
And there was a question about, I know that you do have most of the presentations in both English and French, or like the slides, right? Or would you be able to put the English ones into the chat if you have them for this one?
I don't have it for this one here. So I will ask Marion at once she's returned to New Brunswick, because it seems she's traveling at the moment, if she can provide an English version of these slides to me. I do ask all of my speakers, if possible, to provide bilingual slides, but not all of them are able to, and they don't have the capacity to. So it means that I might, in time for a conference like this, I will see if I can get it for after to post it. But yeah, so that's the nature of the way the conference was put together for this one here, at least.
Okay.
I see Carolyn's entered the waiting room there. So we're going to try to get her up as quickly as possible to keep our schedule on track. If there's any last questions from Marion before, Carolyn gets herself situated.
Just a comment, Zahira.
Oui.
yes, when I return, when I come back in New Brunswick, I will send you two versions, this one in French and the other one in English.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And
We
I'm very
appreciate it.
sorry, I have to go for the boarding, so.
No, we appreciate your time and being able to like squeeze yourself into this time slot. And wishing you well for your travels. Okay. Salut Marion.
Merci. Et puis bonne suite de
Thank you,
rencontres à tout le
and
monde.
I hope everything goes smoothly for the rest of it.
How are you? Yourself.
So I'm Caroline Metz. I'm managing director.
Oh, you got yourself going there.
Great, thank you. I'm managing director at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. We're a research group based out of the University of Waterloo, and we work to develop solutions to reduce risk from extreme weather and climate change, primarily flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. And I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm sharing a presentation on reversing or considering options to protect individuals, communities, and residences from extreme heat, and really a spotlight on nature-based solutions and other solutions that provide benefits, holistic benefits. And the work that I'm sharing, I'll just give you a little bit of background. It's based on national guidance that was published by the Intact Center in April on how we can protect against extreme heat. And this report wasn't put together in isolation. It really represents contributions from over 65 subject matter experts, including several folks from the New Brunswick Environmental Network. And we're grateful for all the input and all the review that's gone into the content of this work. This is really a starting point for guidance. The Intact Center is continuing to advance this work with partners in the health sector, so we're really excited about that. By way of a brief agenda, I'm going to cover why we need to adapt to extreme heat in Canada, then an overview of extreme heat projections for the country, some of the actions to reduce risk, and then we'll look at some of the multiple benefits that we can achieve while at the same time lessening the impacts from extreme heat. Next slide, please. So this is not just an environmental issue. We know that Canada has warmed and will continue to warm further in the future, and this warming is essentially irreversible. The climate change that we're experiencing, it goes beyond impact to the environment. It's as much of a social issue and a financial issue as it is impact to the environment. The blue graph that you see here with the upward sloping line, it represents insured losses from catastrophic events. And these are weather-related natural disasters that cost more than 25 million in insured property losses. And for the last 2 years, we've averaged about 2 billion in insured losses. And we know that for every dollar of insured loss, there are $3 to $4 of uninsured loss that are borne by governments, by businesses, and by individuals. So the financial costs are really mounting. But what's unique and makes extreme heat a very pressing issue is that it's lethal. People can die, not to be indelicate, but the magnitude of the loss in terms of human life is significant. And the table in the lower right-hand side of the slide there, it shows that in the West Coast, the heat wave of 2021, there were over 800 lives lost, while there was very little economic and insured loss. So just a flavor for the financial impact from extreme weather and the loss associated with extreme heat. Next slide, please. So tackling climate change, our work at the Intact Center focuses on climate adaptation, but we're aware of the need to tackle climate change on both fronts: adaptation to manage the impacts, and then mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. So it's not really a choice. We need to do both. And there's a lot of support for this. The federal government just released the country's first national adaptation strategy with clear projections, including how to manage extreme heat and programs to help protect Canadians from the impacts of extreme heat. Next slide. So in terms of bad or unfortunate news, the evidence suggests that urban areas, so our cities, towns, municipalities, are really the hot spots of global warming. And the challenge is that urban areas are where we have a concentration of population, but also some particular structural dynamics that kind of exacerbate heat. It's become a national issue for Canadian cities and towns. In our cities, we have what's known as an urban heat island, meaning that urban areas are significantly warmer than surrounding areas. And this is because of factors like city geometry, also heat from human activity, and the fact that our artificial hard surfaces really retain heat and then they re-emit this heat to a much greater extent than vegetated or natural surfaces. We've also built over or paved many spaces within our urban centers. We've taken out vegetation, we've removed water sources, and this all exacerbates the urban heat island effect. So what we end up with is we're seeing surface temperatures in our cities that are 10 to 15 degrees Celsius hotter than surrounding areas. And at nighttime, we don't get a cooling effect. On average, we see about 7 in 10, there's a typo at the bottom of the slide there, it should be 7 in 10 Canadians live in one of the large 35 metropolitan areas in our country. And we focus on this in our report. Next slide, please. So in terms of extreme heat indicators, the data here comes from source climateatlas.ca, and it's a really great resource if you're interested in climate change indicators. We looked at 3 different indicators for extreme heat in our report. And the first is annual number of days of 30 degrees Celsius or higher. The second is annual warmest temperature, maximum temperature, and then annual length of heat waves. And in looking at these maps on this slide, particularly the bottom 2 maps, we can see that there are 3 areas that are really impacted or projected to be greatly impacted by extreme heat. And these are the lower or low-lying areas between the West Coast and the Rocky Mountains. And then we have prairie regions bordering the US. And then north from northern Lake Erie, right along the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence River Valley. And these are the areas where there's a significant percentage of Canadians or the population lives. So with that concentration and the effect of extreme heat, there's a real need for us to understand this and take protective measures. Next slide, please. So we ranked the census metropolitan areas and we mapped them. And what's shown here are the size of the red circles represents the population that's living there. And you can see that the areas most impacted by extreme heat are where some of our largest population centers are, like Winnipeg, Windsor, London, Toronto, Kingston, Ottawa, Montreal. And there's also smaller communities that are exposed to extreme heat where we also need to be concerned. Next slide, please. So if we look at who's most impacted or who's most vulnerable in terms of extreme heat, it's really 3 groups. So it affects people who are more exposed to start with, and this includes people living in housing that's poorly adapted or have mobility issues or are socially isolated, as well as people who work outdoors for a living. Secondly, people with increased sensitivity to extreme heat are affected, and this includes older adults, children, pregnant women, and people with pre-existing medical conditions. And then thirdly, people with less resources and information tend to be more affected, and this includes lower income individuals, the homeless, and anyone in underserved communities. So there are a lot of factors to take into account for how people can adapt or help themselves. And this gives you a bit of insight into the analytics that went into our work. Next slide. So the good news is that there's a lot that we can do, a lot of actions that we can take to reduce risk when it comes to extreme heat. And I'm going to shift and walk through some of the solutions now and the actions that can be taken, which is really a big focus of our work and of our report that we produced and our ongoing work. In terms of our work, we've grouped it into 3 types of actions that can be taken to mitigate for extreme heat. And the first is non-structural action, so the orange column in the table. And these are based on planning and changing behavior. And then there are green infrastructure solutions. So we're looking at using trees, vegetation, natural habitats, including water bodies, because effectively they also help to reduce heat and provide cooling in cities, as well as nature does in cities. And then the third type of action is gray infrastructure. So how we retrofit or how we design our buildings and infrastructure makes a big difference on our experiences with extreme heat. Next slide, please. In terms of individuals, so we've got our 3 categories of groups that are affected. If we look at individuals and the actions that they can take, we've broken these down by audience. There's a section for individuals, and these are things that single people can do. There's also a category for property owners and managers of multi-residential and commercial buildings. And then there's a section or a category for what communities can do. And in our report, if you happen to look at it, there are icons where you can click and you go directly to a specific table and you can find actions there. So I'll walk through some of the highlights in the following tables that refer to individuals, to property owners, managers, and communities. And a key point that we're bringing forward is that everyone can really make a difference for themselves and their family and friends when it comes to lowering risk for extreme heat. And in terms of individuals, we can work with neighbors, our friends and families to be better prepared. We can arrange to have public heat warnings received on our phones for jurisdictions that have that functionality implemented. We can use natural vegetation to cool homes, especially at night, and turn off unused appliances, or if we're replacing appliances, select something that's more energy efficient. And then in the green category for green infrastructure, what we as individuals can do, we can plant trees, we can expand gardens, we can grow vegetation along walls or fences. Something I'll mention, a misconception that I know growing up, I had this within my family, and vines or anything that was growing on walls, the thinking is that it'll damage the wall or brickwork, but there's actually evidence that vines along facades can prolong the life of brickwork if you choose the right species. So that may be of interest to many folks. And then even if you don't have outdoor space at your residence, but perhaps you have a balcony, you can maintain plants and greenery that offers cooling and shading. And then for built infrastructure, the gray column, there's a lot of what we call passive cooling techniques to prevent heat from the exterior entering our homes and buildings. And the picture in the lower right-hand corner shows an exterior window shade. And that's a passive way to keep the building cool. Upgrading insulation is another great way. If you're renovating, you can make your home more airtight, and that helps keep cool air in if you're using an air conditioner, for example. Also installing cooler or lighter colored roofing, walls, paving surfaces makes a difference. And then if you're replacing windows, choosing ones that have heat glazing that reduces the heat gain from the sun. And then at the bottom of the list, we also want to consider air conditioning or heat pumps for vulnerable buildings, especially facilities like healthcare facilities. Next slide, please. And then for property owners and managers, for residential buildings, multi-unit buildings, some of the challenges are a little bit different in that buildings may be older and they're not designed for extreme heat. So you can have higher temperatures on higher floors due to solar radiation. There's also little opportunity for natural ventilation. And then there's another big consideration if there's a power outage in a multi-residential building. residents there are much more vulnerable because elevators don't work, air conditioners don't work, and water can't be pumped to higher floors. For commercial buildings, some of the sensitivities are that the buildings could have sensitive equipment like freezers or laboratories, so that needs to be taken into consideration. So here for property owners and managers, the actions include things like for non-structural, so this is the planning and behavior change side. Building owners can really work to understand what the vulnerabilities are for that building and that property. And in a sense, landlords have a responsibility to help tenants to understand the risk and help them adapt. And then also working to identify those that are most vulnerable in the building who might need some extra help in planning for extreme heat. And then on the green infrastructure side, it's really similar actions to individual homes. So looking at trees, shading, especially in parking lots, that helps to manage stormwater and protect against extreme heat. Also, green roofs provide cooling advantage. Next slide, please. And property owner responsibilities. This is just an example of what the City of Toronto advises for property owners. So suggesting to post information for tenants about the location of an air-conditioned or a cool space or a cool place in the building to provide residents with a place where they can get some relief during an extended heat wave, for example. Toronto Public Health also provides heat relief advice online that can be accessed. So this is something that can be explored and implemented by other municipalities as generally good practice. Next slide, please. And then just briefly on communities, the thinking here is a bit more strategic, but most of the actions are the same with respect to green infrastructure. There's a lot of focus in communities on maintaining and managing tree canopy to more proactively mitigate risk. Also expanding vegetated areas and water bodies. This is establishing what's known as blue-green networks throughout our cities. And these they have a cooling effect as cooling corridors where people can go and get relief from the heat, but it also helps to reduce urban heat. And then in terms of non-structural measures, many cities are mapping social vulnerability. So you can see in the map of Montreal in the top right corner, they've mapped vulnerable populations, and they're actually working on an updated map now. They want to understand where vulnerable people are, and this can be incorporated in emergency planning. And then from a gray infrastructure perspective, looking at adapting community infrastructure. So reducing vehicle traffic, for example, using cars produces a lot of heat and exacerbates heat island effects in cities. So bikes, any other active transportation really makes a big difference. And it also reduces costs, and there's personal health benefits as well. And then also installing reflective pavements that help cool the environment and permeable pavements that absorb water. That makes a difference. So those are the community measures. Next slide, please. Many cities right now have, they've expanded their programs for managing trees and vegetation in the city, where they actually map tree species that have been planted in different locations, and they manage the trees with regular maintenance and care. And this is an example of the map for the City of Calgary's urban forestry, showing locations of trees. And even smaller communities do this. Where I live in Oakville, there's a robust urban forestry program. They manage tree planting and maintenance. You can go online, you can look up information about particular parks or public spaces and see what trees are located there. So it's a really nice resource, and it's a great effort that municipalities are embracing. Next slide, please. In many cities, this Montreal is an example here, they're investing in urban green spaces and really promoting tree canopy and vegetation, recognizing that there are multiple benefits that are achieved all the way from reducing urban heat to maintaining better mental health and well-being, just from bringing nature back to where we live and work. A really important thing to be considering. Next slide, please. And then just in terms of achieving multiple benefits by taking action on extreme heat, I've touched on many of them as we've gone through the last set of slides. We looked at all the actions in our report and our work and some of the additional benefits. And what was evident in this review is that working with nature and bringing nature back really helps achieve the most additional benefits. As you can see by the list of green colored ecosystem benefits in the chart, human and ecosystem services, we typically don't value them in financial terms to the extent that we should, but they are real, they're meaningful benefits, and that should be taken into consideration when making decisions on nature and how we better incorporate nature. Next slide, please. And this slide highlights all of the benefits and what we call ecosystem services that trees provide. So from producing a cooling effect, to taking up carbon dioxide from the air, to reducing rainwater runoff and providing absorption capacity. And then at the street level, we have much more biodiversity. And then when we look at the city level, we greatly reduce the urban heat island effect. We reduce urban particulates. We've got better air quality. We can control runoff, absorption from precipitation. So all of this really makes cities better places, safer places to live. Next slide, please. So just to come back to this point, that climate impact and extreme heat, they're not just environmental issues. With natural infrastructure, we're adding natural capital, which are the natural assets that we depend on for services. And this is linked to human and social capital and produced capital. And there's a lot of effort right now, much more recognition that the real economy encompasses all three of these types of capital. So when we work to enhance natural capital, we're in effect strengthening the overall economy. Next slide, please. And this slide just acknowledges many of the subject matter experts that have contributed to our report on extreme heat. Without them, our work wouldn't have been as robust. So we welcome the input and the feedback and are very grateful for having such breadth of contribution right across the country. And next slide, please. And then just in closing, to summarize, we need to adapt to extreme heat now. There's a lot that we can do to empower residents of buildings, individuals, building owners and managers, and communities to adapt and reduce risk. And nature and our social relationships are really important along with our built environment. And by taking action to prepare for extreme heat, there are many, many win-win opportunities. We can make our communities and our way of life more comfortable and safer and essentially better. Those are my remarks, and I invite any questions or comments and feedback.
Wow, thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Caroline. Sorry there, Zomi.
No, I was just jumping right into the questions.
No, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of, so we are right at our scheduled break right now. So I'm going to ask all the participants if you'll give us 5 minutes of your break time to just let us ask Caroline 2 to 3 questions, and then we'll give you a 10-minute break instead of a 15-minute break so that we can get back on track and schedule. Mm-hmm. So if that's okay with you, Caroline, and as well as the participants, and I'll let Zomi take over.
Sorry for jumping in there so quickly. I'm just so eager to get to these questions. So one of the resources shared was some policies from NB Power about the proximity of trees to power lines. And the question is, how can we plant trees in urban areas in New Brunswick when NB Power doesn't want any shade trees within 13.5 meters, or at least 10.5 meters within power lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's up to residents of communities to work with the municipalities to find some kind of middle ground there, taking into consideration there are challenges with power lines, so we need to be cognizant of those guidelines and work within those bounds. But there's still many opportunities that that can be taken on an individual property, like on a homeowner's property. There's things like along walls or fences, you can grow climbing vines or flowering vegetation, any kind of garden space, enhancing that. Any areas where you think you can take advantage and enhance the vegetation would be fruitful, keeping in mind that yes, there are municipal restrictions and we need to work within those bounds.
Awesome. Are permeable surfaces suitable for freezing climates like northern New Brunswick?
That's a good question. My understanding is there is applicability. The permeable pavements essentially allow water to infiltrate between the pavers, so there's much more opportunity for spacing and absorption of water. But I guess the manufacturer, you need to check the manufacturer's specifications. But from what I understand, yes, they are applicable.
Awesome. Moving right along, has Intact done any work on the correlation of the amount of asphalt to the amount of green space needed to maintain baseline heat levels?
Very good question. We have not to date, but I know that there are other groups, other research groups that are investing quite a bit in understanding extreme heat impact, as well as mitigation measures, including structural aspects of buildings, and those parameters and those variables are being looked at. And I would say that the trajectory for research right now, within the next 1 to 5 years, there's going to be a lot more coming out, considering the tragic events in BC in 2021 in the summer and the loss of life there. There's a lot more investment and a lot more effort being put into better understanding what we can do at all levels to mitigate extreme heat. So I feel really encouraged about that.
You were very quick with your answers, but they are also very informative. I have one more big question and one more quick question, and then we'll go to break. Does the insurance industry seem to support the installation of green roofs on residential and commercial buildings, or are there a lot of complexities there?
There are building complexities. I'm not familiar with insurance requirements or any of the considerations there. It's a topic that is sort of up and coming, in that there are more groups embracing this idea. It generally works best on a new design rather than a retrofit. So if you have an existing building or an existing home and you wanted to add roofing, you need to reinforce structurally. So there are considerations to be taken there. But for new design, it's an attractive feature that can be designed for and implemented, and in a way that would allow for routine maintenance, where you can provide benefits and be able to care for it without it leaking or causing any issues. So I would say there are groups that you can, if you Google, there are not-for-profits that promote green roofs, provide a lot of useful information. And I would say at a home or at a building for a retrofit, more challenge, but for new design, definitely a big option and a plus.
Nice. Amanda has put more information in the chat about permeable surfaces. And the last question is, when might the social vulnerability maps be ready, and how do people get their hands on them?
Great question too. Montreal has really advanced with respect to mapping vulnerable populations. And we're actually undertaking a project now to work with a health agency at a national scale to develop or to explore this topic further, to think about how do we, across the country, design a program for identifying vulnerable populations, and then how do we develop a system to check in on them. So it's mapping their locations and being aware of that, but then also how do we build in a system to check on them, so to see if they're well hydrated, to see if they have access to cooling, either a fan or other means of cooling where they live, or do they have someone who can take them to a cooling center in the event of a heat wave? So first identifying where vulnerable groups and populations live, and then developing a system, a check-in system for them, working with community resources, not-for-profits, for example, Canadian Red Cross or Salvation Army, or some of the groups that are very active in communities now, taking advantage of those relationships and engagements with neighborhoods and with individuals to provide information and resources and an opportunity to check in on vulnerable people.
That's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Carolyn. We appreciate your presentation. It was very well received, I think, from all the questions we've seen. And I hope you can stay for the rest of the afternoon. But if not, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.